Randy K here. We all go through struggles at times, and I want to share with you through stories and insights and interviews with others how much God loves you. He loves you immensely, and that's what I hope you will hear through our interviews and what we have to share with you. Thanks for staying tuned. Here we go. Hi, welcome. Today my guest is Jeff Olson. We've been talking prior to this interview, and I feel like we have a kindredness, a brotherhood between the two of us. You're going to really enjoy listening to this dear brother, Jeff Olson. He has such a tender heart and conveys the love of God despite having gone through a horrific accident. During this accident, he lost his wife, his 14-month-old youngest son. He was in the hospital for several months, broken bones, broken back, and eventually his leg was amputated. But the message he carries today is one that is profound for each of us, that will bring us closer to God. So, Jeff, it's great to have you with us today.
Randy, it's an honor, and it's a pleasure to be on the show. Thank you for having me.
Well, thank you. And I do want to make note that there are 4 books that we'll make mention of during this episode. The first one is one that I thoroughly enjoyed, which is I Knew Their Hearts. That was your first book. We'll talk about some of the subsequent books that you have authored along with the final one, which is a children's book with your son. But first, I know, Jeff, you've told this story a number of times, but if we can, and I'll leave it up to you as to where you would like to start, but obviously this was a horrifically traumatic event for you at the time.
Yeah, it was traumatic, and I can speak of it now. It took a while. I mean, early on, even for years, I would just cry. I couldn't speak of it. Now enough time has passed. Grief isn't something that you get over. I believe you get used to it. It's like carrying a stone in your pocket. It doesn't go away, but you get used to the weight. And of course, I've had divine support in that weight. And I think, to share it, it would be nice to go to the morning of the accident. And it was the Monday after Easter, of all things. We'd taken a family road trip, and we had celebrated the Easter holiday, which I think is, ironic, and yet there's no irony. There's no accidents in this divine plan, and yet there's always choice. But as we finished Easter and as we were leaving Monday to come back home, we'd said our goodbyes. We were seeing my wife's family, her parents, and we had hugged everyone, and I buckled the kids in the car, and we were just pulling away from the curb. And my wife said, stop. I thought she'd forgotten something. And I put the car in park and looked at her, and she said, I just want to go say goodbye to Mom and Dad one more time. Now, at the time, I thought, oh, women, we've said goodbye. We're on our way. But I watched as she ran up to the porch, and she not only hugged, but she kissed her mother and father. And, then she joyfully jumped back in the car, and we buckled up and went. But the reason I want to start there, and I call them whisperings, when the Spirit gives you that nudge, hey, just go say goodbye to Mom and Dad. Stop the car. I'm going to go do this. That's one thing I've really learned, is when we get those spiritual nudges, act upon them. And she did. And as the day played out, that was the last goodbye. I put the car back in drive. We headed for the interstate. I set the cruise control, and 75 miles an hour was as fast as I could legally go. And I was pushing it. I was in a hurry to get back. We had a 4-hour drive ahead of us. And it was about an hour or so into that drive that things went awry. And there was reports of crosswinds. There was reports of a red pickup truck driving erratically on the interstate. One of the hardest parts of the story is, I believe what happened is that I may have just dozed off. I didn't necessarily fall asleep, but dozed off, swerved to the right, overcorrected to the left, and the car, as I lost control, began to roll, not off the freeway, but down the interstate at 75 miles an hour. And it was a horrific crash. I blacked out for the actual rolling of the car. And I was told by accident reports it may have rolled 6 or 8 times. But when the car came to a stop, I was completely conscious. I'm like, wow, what, And the first thing I was conscious of was my 7-year-old, my oldest son, crying in the back seat. I could hear his cry. And as a father, I'm like, wow, I've got to get to my boy. But that's when I realized I couldn't move. I was pinned either to the seat or the floorboard. I couldn't tell. There was the rancid smell of gasoline. There was all the broken glass. I was actually unaware of my injuries. The adrenaline had taken over. Now, I knew I was struggling to breathe. I knew I was in pain. I was unaware that both of my legs had been crushed. And as you mentioned, the left leg eventually amputated. My back had been broken, but it had only cracked the vertebrae. My spinal column was not damaged. Thank goodness I can still move. My right arm had been nearly pulled off. My rib cage had been damaged and my lungs were collapsing. And then the seatbelt had cut through my lower abdomen and ruptured all my intestines. I was in a horrible state. I was unaware. All I knew was my son was crying. I wanted to get to him. And that's when I realized that no one else was crying. And I was aware. I was aware at the scene of the accident that both Tamara, my wife, and Griffin, my youngest son, they had been killed instantly. And that's the darkest place I believe I've ever been in. I mean, here I was trapped. I have a hysterical child I cannot get to. Half the family has passed. And I was driving the car. I mean, Randy, the guilt, the grief, the regret, I wanted those 3 seconds back. What happened? How can I do this? Can I rewind time somehow? And just the overwhelming trauma and grief and regret. It's the darkest place I've ever been in. And I only set that up not to be graphic or morbid. But it was in that darkness that I experienced light. I literally felt light come. And when I say that, when we talk about the near-death experience or the out-of-body experience or the divine, words are difficult. It's difficult to put into words, but light came. It surrounded me. It embraced me. It seemed to be comforting me. It felt like I was rising above the scene of the accident. And suddenly I could breathe. Suddenly the pain was gone. And my thought was, how can I possibly be okay? That was my thought. How can I, what's happening? Now, I was and am a believer, but to experience this was different than a belief. I was experiencing it. And as I came to, terms with, wow, I'm okay and I'm being comforted by this light, my wife, who I knew was deceased at the scene, suddenly she was in the light with me. She was there and she was gorgeous, not to be morbid. I knew at the scene of the accident, her life had been taken. But in this experience that felt very physical, but I seemed to be out of the body, she was gorgeous. There was no injuries. There was nothing like that. And yet she was emphatic. She was saying, Jeff, you've got to go back. You've got to go back. You can't come. You can't come with. You've got to go back. And Randy, we had a conversation. We talked about the fact that if I stayed with her, we were orphaning a young 7-year-old in the back of the car that at this point she communicated, he's going to be okay, but you've got to go back and raise our boy. And I learned a lot about choice. I mean, there I was looking at the woman I loved more than life, and yet I knew I had a little boy in the backseat of that car. And I've almost learned that for me, one of the most powerful cosmic rules, if you will, is free will and choice. I was to choose, and we made the choice together that I was going back. And I said the most profound goodbye I'll ever say.
I can't imagine that. Jeff, you said goodbye to Tamara, your wife, at that point.
Yeah, I mean, it was literally, this is goodbye. And yet the profound thing too is, well, but you're here, like you're alive and well, and so am I. And so I suppose it was till we meet again rather than goodbye forever, and we can talk about that later. I felt her angelic support in this whole scenario in profound ways, but we made the choice, and I made the choice that I was coming back. And in doing so, once again, I didn't have to figure out how to return. We have no idea how powerful our thoughts are, the intention. I'm going back. And boom, suddenly I found myself wandering around a hospital, moving about a hospital. Now, I was still a little confused. I was in spirit. I was encountering the doctors, the nurses, the patients, and the families of the patients in a busy level 1 trauma center. I later found out that people had arrived at the scene. My 7-year-old was banged up a bit, but he physically walked away from the accident. Spiritually and emotionally, he thought the whole family was gone. I had to be extricated from the car, and because of my injuries, I was rushed to a local hospital, a remote small town hospital, and they immediately life flighted me or airlifted me to the closest level 1 trauma center. But I didn't know any of that. I knew I had crashed the car. I'd said this goodbye. And here I was wandering about a hospital, seeing, and that's another loaded word, really seeing everyone I encountered. The doctors, the nurses, and it's as if I knew them. It's as if I was them. There was a oneness, there was a connection, and there was a profound knowing, if you will. I knew their love, their hate, their joy, their motivations, their decisions. And I saw them in a way that now I say I saw them as God sees them. And it didn't matter if it was the heroin addict or the saintly grandmother. There was this love. There was this profound connection. I even had a biblical verse as I'm encountering these people, blown away, like, wow, look at their life and look at what they're creating and becoming and what they're being, even in their challenges. And the biblical verse was the famous, in as much as you've done it unto the least of one of these, you've done it unto me. And of course, the Master Jesus was speaking that, and there was a depth to it. I'm like, oh, I thought that was a nice verse about being nice. And yet it's like, no, he was saying, I am the beggar in the street. I am the stranger. I am the man in prison. I am that I am. And this is what I was experiencing. It was this connection of wow, I see their magnificence. I see the divine part of them beyond the body, beyond their habits, beyond their mistakes, or even beyond their glorious life. I was seeing a divine part, or in awe. I was in awe of that. And I finally came up on a body, a man that I didn't feel that from, which I found interesting. And that's when I stepped forward to look. And I realized, that's me. That's my body. I mean, it wasn't me. I was having this profound spiritual connected experience, but there was my body. There was my broken tabernacle. And I knew I had to get back in.
So Jeff, you had this kind of assimilation of kind with others. You could see into their personhood as a spirit apart from your body. But if I understand you correctly, when you came to your body there, which was separate from your spirit that had been released from your body, your
right.
terminal body, that you didn't have that sense of life. You had a kind of a lifeless connection, if you will.
Yeah, no, that's very accurate. And it was sad, actually. I mean, I recognized it. It was sad and profound. I recognized, wow, that's my body. And it was so broken, Randy. I was a mess. And yet I saw for the first time the miracle that the body is. I mean, the miracle. I thought, wow, I took it for granted. I didn't realize that I didn't have to remind my heart to beat or my lungs to breathe. I didn't have to teach my eyes to see or my feet how to walk. I thought that, well, in fact, it was profound in my realization of, look at my body. And I felt God, if you will. There was this mentoring, loving energy. I was told that is, your body is the temple. Your body is the temple, and your spirit must enter it. You must enter that tabernacle and live out your life. But I realized what a miracle our bodies are. And even in my brokenness, as far as the body goes these days, every step is a miracle. I mean, it's like, wow, look at that. My eyes blinked and I didn't even have to think about it. It's a beautiful realization of what it means to be mortal, to be flesh, and to also be a spirit or an eternal soul, if you will.
And did you, when you were having this out of body experience in your spirit, looking upon your body, and your body eventually you went through what, 15 surgeries or something like that?
I'm told 18. My mother was
18.
counting.
Sorry.
I was unconscious
Lost
for a while, but
count.
yeah, 18 surgeries in total to put me back together. Yeah.
Oh my goodness. So you were, it seemed like, and correct me if I'm wrong, it seemed like God was imputing to you just this peace and love. You didn't use those words, but I'm just making an assumption here, because you're not in a state of consternation at this point. You're not looking upon your dead body and thinking, "Oh my goodness, I've lost my wife, I've lost my youngest son." How did you feel at that point? What was going on?
Well, that was the out of the body. I mean, I was aware of what had happened, but there was a profound peace, a peace beyond understanding, even in spite of what had happened. Now, to be honest, going back in the body, and yet that encouraging, oh, I'm entering my temple, I'm entering I'm going back in the body. That was inspiring to go back in. But boy, back in the body, then the guilt, the grief, the regret, the trauma, the pain, the physical, all of that returned in a very, very heavy way. It was very difficult. And you'll relate to this. It wasn't just the initial injuries. Then I developed horrible infections. And then I, through not one, but two pulmonary emboli, or the blood clots that, and they lodged in my lungs as well. The trauma in the body was intense, but I was holding on to the contrast of, wow, this is very real, but this is the duality. This is the illusion, because I just experienced something that was far more real than what I thought was reality, if that makes any sense.
Makes perfect sense. You were introduced, when people say, and we've heard this commonly, and I have said it myself, that heaven is more real than this world. That duality you mentioned is something that's a conundrum to people. They don't really understand. How can that be? How can the spiritual realm be more real than the physical? So, if you will, explain that a little bit, because not that it's explainable. It's for the most part probably inexplicable, but that you were instantly in your body again. The reality, though, apart from your body and spirit, was more real in what way than the pain and the starkness of what you found yourself
wow. I'm going to share what happened to me in the hospital, and this might assist in defining that, because that's a beautiful question. That's a tough question, but I'm happy to answer that. And yes, I was in the hospital for many months. I think it's interesting to point out that my two most profound experiences, however, were at the scene of the accident, before all the narcotics had been administered. I was on morphine and everything else in the hospital. But at the end of my hospital stay, I was out of ICU, I was out of surgical recovery, I was actually in the rehabilitation wing, and I was healing, I was getting better, and I knew I was going to make it and go home. A profound thing happened. This was at night, and you introduced me as a brother, and I love that, because we are brothers, my own brothers, my flesh and blood siblings. My brothers stood by me in such a way. In fact, my younger brother was with me this very night. He was going to sit with me till I fell asleep. I was still grieving miserably. I was still struggling, but I was going to make it. I was living and I was going to be coming home. I was only weeks away from coming home. I learned what true brotherhood is with my brothers nearly losing their jobs to be by my side. But this particular night, I fell asleep, and he was teasing me. I had laid on my back so long in the hospital, I'd rubbed all the hair off the back of my head. I was bald on the back of my head, and he was receding in front. So he said, "Hey, between the two of us, we're a bald man." And we laughed, and laughter was a commodity because of the pain and the grief. But I laid on my side, and they'd finally stabilized my abdominal injuries, so I could lay on my side, and I fell into a deep sleep. And when I say that, it was a peaceful sleep. In fact, I was conscious while sleeping that, wow, I'm sleeping. And then I felt that light come again, the same light as at the accident. This light surrounded around me. It was comforting me and peaceful in my grief. I felt as if I was rising above the hospital bed. But on this occasion, the light dispensed. It went away. And like fog lifting off a lake, it beautifully just went. And Randy, I was in the most beautiful place. People say heaven and the other side, the spirit world, whatever. Again, words are difficult. The only one word that could even come close to what I was experiencing is I was home. Suddenly I was home. I felt so welcome. And I was alone in this experience at the beginning, but it felt so familiar. I was home, and I had both legs and both feet, and I began to run. And when you talk about explain the difference between physical and this spiritual sensory, I could feel in a very physical way the ground under my feet, the energy of this beautiful ground I was running on. I could feel the intelligence, if you will, of my calves and my thighs. I was more alive and more physical, almost sensual is the word. Like I could feel it, and I was a part of it. And as I ran about gleefully thinking, I'm home and I'm whole. And when I say that, it felt physically whole, both legs, both feet, but emotionally whole, healed. And I began to run. I had been an athlete, before the accident, and I don't run now with the injuries I have, but I was running, and it felt very physical. And as I did, I had this knowing, this message: you're not here to stay. And right at that point, there was this corridor off to my right, and I knew intuitively, oh, I'm to go this way. And I did. I began to make my way down the corridor. And at the end of the corridor was a crib. And Griffin, my little boy, had been sleeping in a crib at only 14 months old. And I was curious, and I raced to the crib. And I looked in it, and there was my little boy. There was my beautiful little Griffin. That was his name, is Griffin. And he was magnificent. I swept him up in my arms. And I don't know if you've ever picked up a sleeping child.
Yes, it's very precious. Yes.
Yeah, there's it's precious and physically, and this is where I'm attempting to answer the question. The heat and the weight of him was there. When you pick him up, and I could feel him solid against me, and I could feel him breathing. I'm not like he's a well. He's as whole as I am. He's not dead. He lives. He's here. I'm holding him. I could feel him, and I could even feel his breath on my neck. And those senses. Wow, I can feel his breath. And I leaned over, and I smelled his hair. And I don't know if you've ever smelled the hair of a loved one. It was, the senses were expanded. It was more physical, more real than this existence or this realm. I could taste his hair, even though I was smelling it. I could experience the life and the light in every cell of his body, and yet we necessarily weren't in bodies, but it felt as if we were. And I'm not pretending that he's a baby in that other realm, but I think God is so good.
Do you think, Jeff, that God may have been assuaging your grief,
Oh,
that is
I know
giving you
that.
peace? You had seen your wife,
Yeah.
and she was alive and beautiful, not
Yeah.
marked by injury. You had
Yeah.
seen your son, and he was alive
Alive
and
and
full
well.
of
Yeah.
life.
And I got to hold him. And when I say God is so good, he knew I needed to hold my little boy. And this, I was experiencing it in a very profound way. As I held him, I began to weep, thinking, wow, I really get to hold him. I get to tell him goodbye too. And I felt a profound, powerful presence behind me. And it was coming closer and closer as I held my little boy. And I knew what I feel is God. Um, all that magnificence coming up behind me. And the interesting thing is, I began to feel the guilt. And I don't know how to explain this, but I'll just explain it. It began to bubble up in me. Wow, my little boy's life was cut short because I dozed off at the wheel and crashed the car. You know, he's here because I messed up and wrecked. And as this presence was coming closer and closer, the guilt and I, you know, why, again, that why can't I have that 3 seconds back? And I had this thought as the presence came closer and closer. I had the thought, I hope there's some way I can be forgiven. And that's when the magnificent happened. And this almost felt physical too, as I had that thought and I'm holding my child. These divine arms wrapped around both of us and held us. And that's when the whole roof came off. The whole lid, there was just this downpour of love, of peace, of connection, of love in such an unconditional way.
Wow.
And communication, which was almost nonverbal. I mean, it was in every sensory I have. I was told there's nothing to forgive. Everything's in perfect order, and you are as beloved as the child you hold. And yet it was magnified. Here I am holding my little boy, who to me is perfect. I mean, he hung the moon, and yet I'm feeling this love from God and it was a very personal experience that I was that loved, but I knew it rippled out that I love my children so magnificently. As you hold your little boy, that's how much you're loved. And it felt as if the entire universe was watching this, was witnessing this, and bearing witness of the love of God, not only for me, but for all of us. It was profound.
Well, what you're sharing is imparting that love of God to all of us. So, indeed, that feeling that you had back then, it is, Jeff, absolutely true, because that's what's happening now. We so much underestimate the love of God, don't we?
Yeah. Yeah. See, I had all my life in my beliefs, I had made it conditional. Well, if I do this, this, and this, then God will love me. And I, as I'm held by God, I had what I've learned is called the life review, and I'm seeing my life, and I'm like, oh no, that was a mistake. I didn't mean to do that. And this magnificent God, this beautiful being, said, "What did you learn from it?" It wasn't judging the mistakes. What did you learn? And I learned this and I learned that, and I said, well, I knew that was wrong, and I did it anyway. And God said, that's your judgment of it, not mine. We love you. We love you. and you're there to learn. That's what life is about. And as much as you love and support your little boy, that's how much you're loved and supported here. And I also got another tutorial on choice. I mean, God said, you can be mad at me the rest of your life and believe that I allowed your family to pass, or that, you know, I wasn't there to watch over you. And that's okay. We love you anyway. And I was told, you can be mad at yourself. You can judge yourself and feel guilty and beat yourself up the rest of your life. And that's okay. We love you anyway. And then the most amazing, profound thing happened, which even confused me. God said, I want you to have the opportunity to exercise your will. And I was like, my will? It's your will be done. Is that not the case? And like I say, this has been somewhat controversial. And I questioned it, my will? And God said, yes, what do you want? And it was explained to me. You can give your son to me. You can exercise your will and hand him over. And therefore he's not ripped away. You're actively giving him to me.
Ooh.
And
Wow.
my will, and this is the part, God said, my will is your will, and your will is my will. That's how much you're loved. My will has always been that you have free will. So what do you choose, my beloved child? What do you choose? And in all that peace and in all that beauty and in all that joy and all that connection, I willingly kissed my little boy and I handed him over. I gave him back, therefore exercising my will, saying, God, I trust you. I love you, and I know how much I'm loved, and he's in good hands. I'm gonna, yes, you take him, you have him, you hold him, and then I woke up or came to myself or was back in the hospital bed, back to the injuries, the amputation, the wheelchair, the colostomy bag, everything that went on with my injuries, but with a much deeper insight, perhaps, of how much not only I and not only Griffin, but how much all of humanity is loved and beloved by God.
Hmm. You know that so many thoughts are going through my mind listening to you, Jeff, because not only did it seem like it was a cathartic process that God had given you and in giving you the choice to hand over Griffin to him, but also you had talked about the God saying that, I think you had said something like, what are you going to do going forward, or something to that effect. Um, and we oftentimes, I've been in the training field, we oftentimes call that the growth mindset. In other words,
Yeah.
what am I going to do better the next time after I've failed the first time? How am I going to use that as a lesson learned? But what you're saying is going beyond that, because Paul actually referenced that as the growth mindset. I mean, not the growth mindset, excuse me, the Christ mindset,
Mm.
which is the Christ mindset essentially is one of almost God teaching us